so that you guys see. What I do to share. Here we go. Okay. Wonderful. Okay, so now we would like to show this slideshow. So today, I thought that we would have a discussion about the power of speech in Jewish thought, and the power of our words. It says in the Talmud, "Ha'omer davar b'shem omro mevi geula la'olam," that when someone cites their sources, they bring redemption to the world. It's an act of intellectual dishonesty to quote things or say things and give people the false impression that they came out of your head. So some of the things that we'll be discussing today did in fact come out of my head, but much of it is actually based on the material of Rabbi Jonathan Sachs. So we'll be taking a look at some of his ideas, primarily in the power of speech in Jewish thought. So let's begin. Hashem created the world with 10 utterances. And you think about it, in the first chapter of Genesis and a little into chapter 2, God says, Vayomer, and he said, right? Vayomer Hashem Yihi Or, Vayihi Or. So, and there are 10 instances of the word Vayomer. So God created the world with speech. It's an interesting idea, right? There was no act. It wasn't even an intention. It was deliberate speech. And of course, tradition holds. What language did God himself speak? Hebrew. The world was created in the Hebrew language, which sets Hebrew aside. That's why we call it Lashon Kodesh, the holy tongue, because it has a special importance and depth that other languages don't have. Verse from Genesis 2:7, Hashem formed the human from the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and the man became a living creature. That's from Genesis 2:7. What's fascinating is that one of our earliest commentaries on the Torah was a man by the name of Onkelos. It's a Roman name. He was actually a nephew of the Caesar, and he defied his uncle. He was banished from Rome, but he converted to Judaism. And he proceeded to write a commentary on the Torah in Aramaic. And all translation, of course, is interpretation. And so it's one of the reasons I'm not crazy about the prayer books that we use, because the translations I find some of them really problematic. But in any case, Onkelos, this term, God breathed into the nostrils of man the breath of life. Onkelos renders it the power of speech. When God vivified this clod and it became man, at that same moment, God gave humans the power of speech. And I used to argue with my 7th graders because I say only humans have the power of speech. And they would go, no, my dog talks to me. I communicate with my kitten, but of course, what I mean is to be able to express abstract thought, to formulate abstract thought.
At the same time, he gave people a soul and a sentient mind.
Yes, absolutely. In fact, Rabbi Sachs is going to make that link in a slide here in a few minutes. Also, of course, God gave us the Torah via the 10 utterances. In English, we call them the 10 Commandments, but that's imprecise. It's the Aseret HaDibrot, the 10 utterances, diber, to speak, because actually there are 613 commandments, not only 10. So they're called the 10 Commandments, popularly, thank you, Cecil B. DeMille, but really they were the 10 utterances, and what sets these commandments aside from the other 603 is that they were uttered by on Mount Sinai, by God to the Jewish people who heard these words, thunder from the mountaintop, right? The other ones were given through Moses when he went up to the mountain to receive the rest of the Torah. So
Did the people hear all 10, or they had to stop at 3?
yeah, the Talmud says that when this encounter between God and man was so intense that when they heard Anochi Hashem Elokecha, I am the Lord your God, everybody died. And God had to revivify everybody, which was quite traumatic and exhausting. And then he gave the second commandment, and people died again. So after that, the Torah itself records, this is way too intense for us. Moses, you go up to the mountain, get the rest of it. Whatever God tells you, we'll be happy to listen to. But this is just way too intense for us to hear. So there is that idea out there.
So it was only in First Kings 3 that God speaks in this short.
Well, I mean, it could be that he spoke the others as well, but also it says that people stood back from a distance, they got scared. So this is open, subject to interpretation.
Asking is about the thunder. Is that I was struck, like I said, about about Elijah in the cave, about the cold Dimamad the Kama. And so that was not the case then at on Sinai. It was in thunder.
It was a very stormy day. The Torah says that there was thunder and lightning. The Torah actually specifically says that people heard the lightning and saw the thunder. Like their senses were short-circuited in that singular encounter with God. But the point is that we're talking about the power of speech. So I'm laying the groundwork for the fact that God himself uses speech in the process of creation, right? God uses speech to give us the Decalogue. So speech has a very, very important place in Jewish thought. We generally tend not to think very much about how we use words, particularly in the age of Facebook, where everyone is encouraged to say whatever comes to mind with very, very few filters. I always tell the story of a distant cousin of mine who woke up one morning and said, I'm having my coffee and I'm cramping. It's like, why do you need to tell me this on Facebook? It's like living life in your front yard. We're in a culture that says express yourself fully and deliberate speech means thinking about the impact of your words on the other person. Speech is a form of a negotiation, and if I'm trying to get Scott to say yes to my proposal, how I choose my words, how they're going to fall on his ears is a very, very important aspect in whether we're going to be successful in this dialogue or not. People don't think like that. The Torah is very, very, very admonishes us constantly about choosing our words carefully. I once asked my 7th graders, and they freaked out. So what happens if you only had 500 words a day?
What does this mean, have only?
I'm sorry, meaning you have an allotment of 500 words a day. After that, you're mute. They don't carry over. How carefully would you consider every single word that you say in the course of the day? Would there be any room for Lashon Hara? Right? We would weigh our words much more carefully if we were paying by the word. Right? And we don't think like that, but we should. So this is, I'm always disinclined to give a lot of text on these slides, but this is so important, and I think it's worthy of discussion. Judaism, like other religions, Rabbi Sachs says, has holy places, holy people, sacred times, and consecrated rituals. He says what made Judaism different, however, is that it is supremely a religion of holy words. With words, God created the universe, as we just said, and God said, let there be light, and there was. Through words, he communicated with humankind, through the Decalogue. In Judaism, language itself is holy. This is the key point. We consider language itself holy. What's so holy about the Torah scroll? Is it the parchment and the wood? It's the words, right? It's the holiest thing we have. Language itself is holy. That is why he continues Lashon Hara, The use of language to harm, and we know what Lashon Hara is, not merely a minor offense. It involves taking something that is holy and using it for purposes that are unholy. It's a kind of desecration. The Gemara says that when somebody speaks Lashon Hara, they misuse their power of speech, they injure three people: themselves, the person listening, and the person that they're talking about. It's unattributed, and I don't know who said this, but small minds talk about people.
Oh,
Mediocre minds speak about current events,
things.
sports, whatever. But great minds speak of ideas. And I'm always inveighing upon people to keep our dialogue in the sphere of ideas. That's what this philosophy course is about, ideas, right? Unless there's imminent danger to somebody, a child molester or a murderer or the like, we really shouldn't be in the business of speaking about other people, what they're doing, what I heard, what she's doing, and it leads down a bad road. Even the Talmud says to talk nicely about somebody is bad. Why? Because I can say, Ralph is an amazing basketball player, but somebody's going to say, yeah, but from the free throw line, it always descends into something negative, right? Better not to talk about people at all. Obviously, in a case of, imminent danger, we must speak out. But in general, we try not to speak about people. And that's a message that we can really absorb here in our community. So yeah, it's a kind of desecration. I highlighted that. After creating the universe, God's first gift to the first man was the power to use words to name the animals, and thus to use language to classify. This was the start of the intellectual process that is a distinguishing mark of Homo sapiens. We say that human history began with Homo sapiens sapiens, which we say is about 6,000 years ago. Scientists say between 6 and 10,000 years ago. It's the same order of magnitude. We can't be, we don't have enough evidence or data to pin an exact date. It wasn't a Tuesday, unlike the history of the world, part one, it didn't happen on a specific date, but it happened in that range of time. So the Targum translates, and we just talked about this, the verse, the man became a living creature as a speaking spirit. God implanted into him koach l'malala, the power of speech. And this I thought, was very, very interesting. Evolutionary biologists nowadays take the view that it was the demands of language and the advantage this gave humans over every other life form that led to the massive expansion of the human brain. The reason the cranium is as big as it is and the mass of our brain is because of the demands of speech. And how we use speech. I mean, think about the use of speech in poetry. I'm reading this lovely book that Ralph gave me, these short stories. His deliberate use of the language is absolutely breathtaking.
You have no idea how gratifying it is.
I'm deeply impressed.
Yes.
So yeah, but moving on, we could talk more about Irving later, but the point here, and maybe the take-home message of this slide, is that God created the natural universe with words. We create and sometimes destroy the social universe with words. God created universes with his words, but we have a chip off the block, as it were. We may not be able to create universes, but our words have tremendous, tremendous power, which derives from God. So the Mosaic books contain, he goes on, a deep set of reflections on the nature and power of language. Okay. This has much to do with the fact that the Israelites of Moses' day were in a place where, in a time when the first alphabet appeared, the Proto-Semitic script, from which all subsequent alphabets are directly or indirectly derived. It's called Akkadian, but it's Proto-Hebrew, and all the other languages of the earth derive from Akkadian. This is the Proto-Hebrew script that I have listed up there. We don't recognize those letters. We now have a block, what's called the Assyrian script, which was introduced. Yeah, it was, there's a debate in the Talmud. Some people say that the Aramaic or the Assyrian script always existed. Other people say that it was a later development introduced by Ezra. But however we choose to understand the story of the Tower of Babel in Parshat Noach, there was a root language that when people were scattered, they developed variants of that language. And that root language is Akkadian or Proto-Hebrew. So, and his point is that Judaism marks the first transition on a national scale from an oral to a literate culture. Think about that. In the past, histories were taught orally exclusively. Edward Said, the Palestinian at Columbia, made the salons of Manhattan swoon because he said, of course, the Palestinians have no written history. It was all told over fire pits and bonfires with the Finjan. There's no deeds, there's no recorded history. We were a people of an oral tradition. Or oral tradition is narrative. And as we talked about a few weeks ago, narrative tends to get embellished with each retelling. We were the first culture that was a literate culture where we were a text-based culture, where the text itself is unchangeable. The story doesn't change. Moses does not lead the Jewish people or the Israelites through the desert for 41 years in the next telling, 45 years in the next telling. It doesn't happen. All right.
Fish wasn't this big.
Right. Exactly. So we transition from an oral culture to a literate culture. This text that we are constantly engaging with and fighting with and arguing over and everything that we do, the important thing that we do with this text is that we're constantly engaged in this text. That's the unique significance that attaches to the spoken and the written world. We discover this at the very beginning of the Torah, right? It takes the form of a radical abandonment of myth. Everybody's familiar with Joseph Campbell, and the interviews with Bill Moyers. His basic thesis that all religion is myth. It's stories that are told and retold and are codified and concretized, but they all began with stories. Yes.
Joseph Campbell confirmed over a phone call. I won't tell you how long ago. And here are his direct words, because he was a bit of an anti-Semite.
I know he was.
Yes, Mr. Professor. The Jewish tradition, with its hard-bitten monotheism, is the only text that I can cite where a mortal has an actual argument with God.
We're going to discuss that. Absolutely. Yeah. Very good point. Very good point.
He was so as much as I have most of the books, or I read most. So I have to thank him, even though I heard from he taught at Sarah Lawrence. Was it as you say, he didn't. He didn't.
He was a shtickle anti-Semite. But the point is that myth is arbitrary. A written text is not arbitrary. And that's one of the gifts of the Jewish people in our culture to the world is this text.
Also, though, a real happening can become a myth through the hazes of time when you lose that connection to it, which often happens in oral traditions as you lose that connection. The oral traditions are fantastic, but with writing, you're able to achieve civilization.
Right.
Because you can't really without it.
I think you're 100% right. So, Rabbi Sachs's point is that think about all of the myths. Yeah, think about the Titans, the precursors to the Olympian gods. They all fought, right? Everything is a fight. Everything was a struggle. Everything was a conquest. When our God created the universe, he simply spoke. There was no fight between gods. There was no conquering. There was no subduing anything. No victory. It was simply was. Language creates worlds, is Rabbi Sachs's point. So, you were going to say something, yeah.
So the myths of the Greeks and Romans and their gods. One of the main differences is that we have a covenantal relationship with God, whereas those myths and legends have no covenantal bearing whatsoever. As a matter of fact, the gods of the myths really didn't care at all about the people.
You're right. And it wasn't a dialogue. The dialogue only went in one direction.
Right.
People offered offerings in the temple of Diana or the temple of Zeus to propitiate the god, to make them happy, to buy them off,
Exactly.
right? When the offerings that we offer in the temple service in Jerusalem are not to propitiate the god. It's a dialogue. It's an I'm sorry offering. It is that's what a chatat is. A chatat is the oleh, the elevation offering is an I love you God offering. The shlamim, where everybody eats a piece of the animal, is a let's party with God offering. It's called a peace offering because everybody enjoys a piece of it. The Kohanim and the Leviim had a piece, the owner had a piece, the altar had a piece, as it were, God. And the love was spread around. But it was not to propitiate a God, as it was in the myth cultures, as you're talking about. It was to buy them off because there was no dialogue with the God, right? And we'll come back to that point. But we've talked about divine speech, but let's talk about the power of human speech. So J.L. Austin was a philosopher of language in England, and he talked about how something he called performative utterance, which means that by using words, you alter reality. You perform an act with your words, okay? Or it's also called an elocutionary act through our mouths. So for example, when a judge says the court is now in session, right? He's not stating something. He's creating a new reality. Those words just changed that, right? He's doing something. When a groom says to his bride under the chuppah, "Harayat mekudeshet li b'taba adzu, kedat Moshe v'Yisrael," and he puts that ring on her finger, he's not just stating what he's doing, he's changing the legal reality and the relationship between those people. His words change the reality. Just like God's words created reality, right? We're creating a fact. So the most fundamental type of performative utterance is making a promise, right? A promise binds us. A promise changes something, okay? It uses language to create an obligation. So, I mean, some promises are unilateral, okay? I promised Scott that I would roll the Torah before Shabbat, so that it would be in the right place and we wouldn't waste time on Saturday morning. It's on me. It's unilateral. Sometimes it is bilateral, right? People make commitments to one another. Sometimes they're highly specific. I promise to pay you $1,000, right? Something like that. Sometimes they're very open-ended. I promise to look after you and you promise to look after me. That's very open-ended and non-specific.
I'll be your best friend.
Yeah, I'll be your best friend. But the supreme example of an open-ended pledge between human beings is marriage, obviously. That's essentially what you're saying. When you write a ketubah to a woman, you're pledging to take care of her and protect her and guard her and feed her and house her and give her everything that she needs. And she pledges the same back in essence, right? So that is what Rabbi Sachs is actually focusing on the two verses, which we'll see in a minute. But the supreme elocutionary act between God and man was the covenant at Sinai. It's open-ended. It's not abrogated. It continues on, right? That relationship was brought on by words, as we said earlier. And it is sustained, that covenantal relationship is sustained by honoring those words. So this is the verses that he's talking about from Exodus before we receive the Torah. God says to Moses, "You have seen what I did to the Egyptians, how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to me. Now then, if you will obey me faithfully and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession among all the peoples. Indeed, all the earth is mine, but you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. It's bilateral. If you keep my covenant, you will be my treasured people. You will be the kingdom of priests and a holy nation. So it's a bilateral promise. This is absolutely revolutionary. It's the most radical proposition in the Torah. And it really has no other counterpart in any other religion. Jesus doesn't say to his followers, if you believe in me, then I will XYZ. It's that came much, much later. That's not a dialogue between God and people. This is a dialogue between God and the Jewish people. What is supremely holy is the language, when it is used to create a moral bond between the two parties. Now, why this is important is because this supreme form of relation is one that does not depend on power or superior force or a dominant submissive hierarchy. There's a great debate in the Talmud. There's a midrash that says that God held that based on just a nuance in the text, we stood, in Hebrew it says tachat hahar, which we render to mean at the foot of the mountain. But literally it means under the mountain. So there's a midrash that says God held Mount Sinai over the people and said, if you accept my law, wonderful. But if you don't, this will be your burial ground. Now that goes against what Rabbi Sachs is saying about this notion of dominant submissive relationship, or that we were coerced into keeping the law. There's a great deal of debate about that midrash. Most authorities feel that certainly by the time of Mordechai and Esther, when it says in the Megillah, Kimu v'kiblu, that the Jewish people accepted, they read into that we finally willingly accepted not only the written Torah, but the oral law. Okay. And so that whole question of whether we were coerced into accepting the Torah is resolved many, many generations later, if you hold that it really was a form of coercion. But the point is that unlike other narratives, religious narratives, there's no coercion. If I recall correctly, when Muhammad encounters Allah in the cave, Allah's trying to choke him. Right? That he has to submit for the chokehold to be released. So that doesn't exist in Judaism.
It's in the name, Islam.
Submission.
It means submission, right? Exactly.
Yeah.
In a covenantal relationship, both parties respect the dignity of the other. That's why we have free will. Think about it. If every single time we misstepped, a bolt of lightning came down and hit us, there'd be no free will. God respects us. Hello, welcome. Come have a seat.
Hey, Tony, help you.
You are?
Tony.
Oh, Tony.
Tony.
Nice to finally meet you. Have a seat, Pub.
I have to go.
Oh,
I have my wife, truck.
you put your wife over here?
Just came to tell you that the books are over there.
Which,
On the books, the
which-
Megillah.
oh, I need the scroll. I need the clock.
Oh,
We're looking for the Megillah scroll.
I don't think we had it, right? I don't know. I don't think we have ever seen it.
Okay, well, it's Hanukkah, which means Purim is around the corner, so we're just trying to plan ahead.
I don't think we never had it. Yeah. Yeah, I gotta go there. I thought you meant the books.
No, thank you so much.
We have classes every Monday, Wednesday. Drop in one day, okay? All right.
Yeah. Brusim habayim, b'shem Hashem, no? All right,
Okay, bye-bye. Bye.
Bye.
Take care.
and I think the important point, and Rabbi Sachs emphasizes this, is that this covenantal relationship that we have with God only occurs by mutual consent. Right? It says if you will obey me. Okay? If. So it has to be, for the relationship to be genuine, it's got to be consensual. Right? The other point is that through language, an infinite God and an infinitesimal human being can find common ground. Think about how we relate to the infinite. We as human beings, what are we? We blink and our life is over. We're dust. Dust in the wind, to quote Kansas. And God is infinite and infinitesimal and unending and all powerful. Ein Sof, Kabbalistic idea, right? So, in fact, as an aside, one of the reasons that the way our prayer book is structured is because we honestly don't know how to talk to God. What's the right language? So we rely very heavily on the book of Psalms, which was written long before us and apparently was very, very effective. We rely on the formula of the Amidah, which was actually said by Moses when he prayed to God. So that first blessing of the Amidah is a paraphrase of what Moses himself said. So, and it was effective. Elokei Abraham, Elokei Yitzchak, Elokei Yaakov, Hahel, Agadol, Agibor, Vanora, El Elyon. That all comes out of the book of Deuteronomy. And so, with due respect to, people that want to modify that so it's more in conformance with our modern ideas, and they want to include the matriarchs as much as the patriarchs, that impulse is understandable, but it's like a recipe. It's a formula. And if you change that formula that works, you're risking the recipe coming out differently, right? And that's why I'm not an advocate of modifying the traditional texts, because they're there for a very, very important reason. Not to diss ladies. I mean, I'm going to do a whole unit on the power of women in Judaism. Women are not second-class citizens in Judaism, even traditional Orthodox Judaism, by any stretch of the imagination.
Right.
But that's a separate subject. That culturally they haven't been made second-class citizens in places like Borough Park and Muncie is a whole separate thing. But according to Jewish law, that's not the case at all. Anyway, so these words have created a binding eternal relationship between God and man through the words. So Judaism, as we said, is a covenant. It's a marriage, as it were, between God and man. The Torah is our ketubah, and that's one of the major themes of Shavuot, the summer pilgrimage festival. The day that we receive the Torah, in many congregations, they set up a chuppah on Shavuot to remind us that this is our marriage contract, as it were, between us and God, right? We're the bride in that situation. And the Torah is a written record of that covenant. And this conversation, speaking and listening, is what makes this covenant possible. That is why we have a dual form of Torah. We have the written Torah, which we're familiar with. We also have, as we discussed, the oral Torah, which was now written, thanks to Rabbi Judah the Prince. But one is the Torah, the written Torah, is God speaking to us. God is saying, this is how I want you to arrange your lives. Take one day off in 7. Eat this, don't eat that. Wear strings on your 4-cornered garments, etc., etc., etc. When we study Torah, it's us talking to God. Or an alternative idea is that when we pray, is we're talking to God. When we study Torah, it's God talking to us. So it is a dialogue. His idea is the oral Torah is our speaking to God because we speak to God by way of interpreting his word. As you said, the oral Torah gives us guidance on how to interpret and understand the written law, because there are many murky verses in the Torah that could be rendered in any different number of different ways. And the oral tradition, which goes back to Moses, says, no, this is the way we read it. Nowhere in the Torah does it say tefillin have to be black squares. You could say, and it should be a frontlet on your Eyes, maybe it's purple and cylindrical. There's nothing in the Torah itself that dictates the form of the tefillin or what verses we write on the scrolls inside. It could be tutti frutti. So we have an oral tradition that says, no, they're square. No, these are the 4 sections of the Torah that we include. That is a tradition that goes back to Moses. So
Your sense of speculation is blasphemous, Rabbi.
And I like this quote from Rabbi Cook, that Judaism is the open-ended, mutually binding conversation between heaven and earth.
Not between man and God, but heaven and earth. That's great.
Between heaven and earth.
That's very nice.
Okay? Now, he goes on to say that despite the deep influence of Judaism on 2 later faiths, the Vilna Gaon said that the mother religion, Judaism, spawned a religion, and Judaism is the perfect balance of justice and mercy. When we wear tefillin in the morning, and there's 2 straps that come off the tefillin shalosh, the head tefillin. One represents God's attribute of mercy. One represents God's attribute of strict justice. Guess which strap is slightly longer?
I would hope the mercy.
Yes. Because strict justice is not true justice. The Torah says a hand for a hand, an eye for an eye. And the Talmud proves that it doesn't mean literally. Why? Because if a paraplegic cuts off the arm of an eye surgeon, and we cut the arm off of the paraplegic in retaliation or for justice, was justice really served? One arm was useless to begin with. One arm healed lives. So it's not a hand for a hand, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. It clearly means monetary compensation, right? But the oral Torah is what teaches us that. Christianity, the Vilna Gaon went on to say, so we have this Judaism, which is the perfect balance of mercy and justice, spawned a religion, Christianity, which is all mercy, turn the other cheek. And later, another daughter religion, Islam, which is strict justice, where they do cut the hands off of thieves in Saudi Arabia, right? We don't do that. So there was sort of a bifurcation or a prismatic effect, as it were, of the white light becoming 2 separate things. But what he points out is that there are no conversations between God and human beings in either the New Testament or the Quran. I think you were saying this, to the extent that we have in the Torah, where God speaks to Abraham and speaks to Isaac and speaks to Jacob and speaks to the prophets, right? We don't see that kind of ongoing dialogue in the New Testament or in the Quran.
It's hidden.
It's single directed. It's unidirectional.
It's hidden in the New Testament. It's implied that Jesus does receive from God, but it's never actually like described.
Explicit.
It's, Jesus talks to God, then Jesus talks to the disciples. It's
Right.
not, you don't see that dialogue between them, or it's, and in a weird way, having grown, the way I grew up, it's like Jesus is taking these things and interpreting them, but it's not necessarily what God said, it's what Jesus interpreted God saying.
Well, it's the idea of a personal God. We can speak to God directly. We don't have to go through priests or
Any intercession, right? Exactly. That's also a very important point. God is accessible to everyone, right? So we have Christianity, which we can characterize as the religion of salvation. They're focused particularly, I think the Protestants, more so perhaps than the Catholics, about what's the status of your soul? Are you saved? Are you going to heaven? Are you going to hell? Right? And they're solely preoccupied about salvation, and the state of the soul. To the extent you had the Calvinists who said only the elect go to heaven, and there's no good works you can do in this world to go to heaven. Works are irrelevant. It was an extreme,
Sola fide.
yes.
144,000.
Sola fide is only belief in God gets you into heaven, right? But and I remember having an interesting dialogue with a missionary who I think she was very sincere, said, "I'm worried about your soul," she said to me as a Jew. And I said,
Thank you.
"I'm going to let my soul take care of itself." And I said, "There is so much good work that needs to be done in this world of clothing the naked and feeding the hungry and helping to support the poor, that I'll let God worry about my soul later."
Yeah.
And that was my answer to her.
It's the idea of in Judaism, what's important is this world.
Absolutely.
And doing good in this world. The rest of it will kind of take care of itself, I guess.
Exactly. In fact, Richard Cohen, I'm not sure if he's listening today. He and I had an interesting dialogue, and I don't know if you know who he is. He's retired now here to Pennsylvania. He's the past president of the Southern Poverty Law Center. And he said to me, "Well, if belief in God and that God wrote the Torah is a prerequisite to being Jewish, I guess I'm not Jewish." And my response to him is, "What you believe is a lot less important than what you do. And look at all the good works that you've done. It's that the Torah says, tzedek, tzedek tirdov, justice, justice you shall pursue." This is a man who dedicated his life to bringing justice to people to whom justice was denied. I think that's one of the most Jewish things you can possibly do. So Christianity is a religion that focuses on the salvation of the soul.
The suffering in this life for the reward in the next.
Right, right. Islam, of course, is a religion of submission, as we've talked about. It's about submission to the will of Allah. There is no dialogue. There's no dialogue. You do. And if you don't do, you die.
Haram.
Is there an important distinction? This is a little bugaboo of mine, but I might as well share it with you guys. Is that, there are, when you speak of, okay, love is a positive thing that presumably we all like, but what drives a lot of us is either guilt or shame. And I'm saying that the shame civilizations get you nowhere. It's guilt civilizations that provide for freedom and the growth of capital. Is that in shame you're only worried about appearances, but in guilt it's, oh my God, what have I done?
Guilt presupposes a context of right and wrong.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Unless you're a sociopath, if you violate what you know to be
Mhm.
wrong,
Mhm.
it's healthy to generate a sense of guilt.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Right? I mean, if you rob that convenience store and you don't feel guilty about it, you have a problem, right? There's a very famous rabbi in the Talmud named Abaye. He's one of my heroes. He was a Babylonian rabbi, and he says, "Kiven nishne naaseh keheter." The first time you do something wrong, you feel guilty about it. When you do it over and over again, it feels natural. You lose your natural sense of guilt by doing it over and over again.
But you can excuse yourself for one time,
Yes.
not the second time.
Yeah. Our religion, though, Rabbi Sachs wants to say, is a religion of sacred dialogue. What's supremely important in Judaism is the power of the word. It's the power of the word. I've had people say to me, gosh, church is only an hour. Why is synagogue 2.5 hours on Saturday morning? I've got so much to do. And I think they fail to appreciate the power of the dialogue that we're engaged in with God during those 2.5 hours. Think about it. We read the Torah, which is God talking to us, and we pray, which is us talking to God. So the use of language to create a moral bond of love between the infinite and the infinite, and the infinite and the finite, through this covenant that we have through the Torah on one hand, and through the conversation, this ongoing dialogue we have with God on the other. One of there was a vice president of the Rabbinical Assembly who about 25 or 30 years ago said that there's not enough God talk in conservative congregations. That's the term he used. And that truly spiritual people are engaged in a constant dialogue with God throughout their day. Not just when they're in shul, not just when the prayer book is open. There's formal prayer, which is important, but there's informal prayer, which should be an ongoing dialogue. Look at Tevi the milkman. As a trivial example, he's constantly talking to God, right? So the fact that we have this conversation is what makes Judaism different. And that's what these two verses, this prenup before God gives us the Torah, is all about, right? It's bringing the relationship into being through the power of words. So I hope I've given you some things to think about with regards to language, and hopefully we can move forward and perhaps be more deliberate in our language. I think sometimes when people get upset, they tend to say things that they regret. There's a whole tractate of the Talmud that deals with the Nazir, person who makes a vow to abstain from certain things. And the Talmud comes to the conclusion that most vows that are made are rash. They're usually made when somebody is hot-headed, and then they come to regret the vow. Someone is in a fight and says, I'm saying, I wish you were dead. And then later they feel terrible, right? They should never have said that.
Well, there are multiple laws in the Torah about, I don't think they're both vow, when you have to keep a vow, when it can be nullified.
Right.
Kol Nidra.
Yeah.
Yeah, so there are a bunch of laws about it.
You know why Kol Nidre came to be?
I think that's from the Inquisition.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Those that they were called anusim, people that were compelled to convert and vow allegiance to the church. Kol Nidre was included on Yom Kippur, so that those vows that they made against their will would be annulled, and that they wouldn't carry the guilt that they had, that somehow they had willingly converted to Catholicism.
So the Christians use that as, Jews don't have to keep their word, because every year it's negated.
And that's why the verbiage was subtly changed, so that it was strictly talking about vows in the future. Yom Kippurim zeh ad Yom Kippurim. So any vows we make in the next year to diffuse that. But the reality is, if you talk to Islamic scholars, Muslims, when they make agreements with non-Muslims, with infidels, they are under no legal obligation to honor them. They're tactical and they're not strategic.
The dhimmi thing.
Yes. And so, Arafat was happy to promise to renounce violence at Oslo on the White House grounds. And the minute that the ink was signed, he went back on that because it didn't suit him anymore. So the irony is that which they accuse us of is often that which they're guilty of themselves.
Well, and I mean, Catholic tradition, you go to confession if you fail. That's where you confess your sins and are forgiven for them.
Mhm.
So it's a similar concept there again, but Christians, Catholics have used that as a way to demonize and attack Jews throughout history. Sorry about that.
You don't have to apologize. You're not responsible for it.
But I don't, yeah, it's just, I'm trying to find the words for it, but like it's taking the same idea but in Christianity, a lot of modern, I would say Protestants it's not so much about salvation anymore as it is about punishment.
Interesting.
And that's what I keep seeing in a lot of modern Christian movements is less about salvation and more about punishment.
Hmm.
Especially when you deal with like fundamentalist Christians, so much punishment. Jehovah's Witnesses, only 144,000 people can go to heaven. You know,
Who
it's
says that?
the Jehovah's Witnesses. It's 144,000. That's the amount of people that can go to heaven. 144,000.
So why are they bother converting everybody?
I have no idea.
The quote is filled.
My dad used to argue with Jehovah's Witnesses every Sunday, so very familiar.
Interesting.
It was his favorite thing. They'd come, he'd argue. It was good times.
All right, guys. First of all, thank you so much. for
Thank
coming.
you.
I hope that was.
It gives